Bonjour à tous, merci, je vous félicite d'être là, vous avez bravé la pluie, les encombrements et vous êtes là pour ce deuxième jour de réflexion dynamique avec aujourd'hui un thème évidemment fondamental, celui des pays émergents. Et donc je vous dis bienvenue dans cette deuxième journée du Forum du Nouveau Monde, du Forum Nouveau Monde. Et je vais vous donner la parole, Nina Dos Santos, c'est l'une des grandes signatures de CNN qui est partenaire de ce forum. Très bon débat, Nina. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Ulysse. Et bonjour, messieurs et mesdames, je suis ravie d'être ici. Je vais continuer cette discussion en anglais, comme Ulysse nous avait dit là maintenant, c'est sur les pays émergents et les nouveaux espaces émergents. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. So, as Ulysse said, I'm Nina Dos Santos from CNN. Before introducing our panelists today, I'd just like to say a few words about the subject at hand. The emerging markets has been a theme that has dominated the world economy over the course of the last 10 or 20 years. But obviously, this is a subject that is changing very quickly. Just a few thoughts for you here. In 1990, China had only just made it to the top 10 economies in the world. Now, obviously, it stands at number 2. And on aggregate, people are expecting China to become the world's #1 economy, eclipsing the United States by at least 2025. But obviously, for the people inside these countries, these economic changes have had transformative effects on their lives. They've created enormous megacities. A number of the cities in China are now bigger in terms of population than an entire EU country, like, for instance, Portugal, which is where my husband comes from. And whether it's China or India, governments and companies themselves have to respond in terms of development issues, in terms of infrastructure issues to plan for these transformative effects. Companies also have an opportunity here to embrace an enormous and burgeoning growing middle class. But what we've also seen from the recent concerns about the expanding current account deficits for some of these countries is that sustainable growth of these emerging market economies is also something that needs to be looked into very, very deeply. So let me first of all start out by introducing our speakers today. As I said before, it's a broad topic, so we've got a very broad range of speakers here. From the world of development, I'd like to welcome Khalid Malik, who's the lead author of the 2014 Human Development Report at the UNDP from New York. Thank you very much for coming here today. We also have Mario Pizzini sitting next to him there, who's the director of the OECD Development Center here in Paris. Jan Svenjar, who's the professor of global political economy at Columbia University, and he's the director of the Global Economic Governance Unit there, coming over from New York. Santiago S. Uno is an entrepreneur from Indonesia. He is the president and director of PT Saratoga Investama Sedaya. So it's going to be fascinating hearing what you have to say from the business community there, Santiago, as well. And last but not least, Reuben Abraham, who's the CEO and senior fellow at the IDFC Institute. He's the visiting fellow of the urbanization program at the Stern School at New York University and the campus in India. Great to have you on the show. Well, so the campus in New York. Apologies here, says India. Great to have you all here for this particular debate. Let's start out with you, Khalid Malik, because one of the interesting dynamics I want to highlight to our audience here is that you're very, very experienced in China, and also Reuben, obviously India is your forte as well. These are the two sort of tiger versus the dragon economies, and they have very different ways of approaching their economic challenges and opportunities. Where do you think China is going to be in terms of this new emerging market space? It's been dominant for so long.
First of all, good morning, everyone. And it's wonderful to be here again, so I hope people are not tired of listening to me. I think what is fascinating was that, I lived in China for about 6 years, and before I went to China, you do the preparatory work, you listen to people, wise people from Harvard and Columbia, but when you get to China, you realize what is happening in China is very different from what people tell you is happening in China. China has been growing by 9–10% for the last 30 years, recently 7.5% or so. It has lifted 600 million people out of poverty, which is remarkable. It has a highway infrastructure which is actually better than the US. And if you go to city after city, you realize that you don't see squalid settlements easily. So you really, and there are about 50 cities in China, which are between 5 to 10 million people each. So the scale is phenomenal. And so I ended up writing a book about China. And I learned that when you write books, you should get the title right and the cover page. The rest doesn't matter so much. And the title was, Why Has China Grown So Fast So Long? And people kept asking me, what will happen in the next 15, 20 years with China keep on growing? And my own view was that, which was a very optimistic view, that it will keep on growing for very simple reasons. One, that you have the underlying drivers of growth are still there. People are moving to urban areas, 300 million people over the next 15, 20 years. The size of Europe itself in some ways. You have an elite who is very clear that if they do not keep increasing their benefits to people, their raison d'etre disappears. So the incentives are very strong for them to keep moving it forward. And just to add some other figures, it's not just that China is growing, but the South is getting more connected. Last year's report, Global Human Development Reports, was on the rise of the South. It's not just China, but also 40 other countries doing much better. China-Africa trade in 1999 was $2 billion. Last year, over $200 billion. China has become the number one, number two partner in investment, trade, aid in almost every African country. So what you're seeing is a massive realignment of the world, and it's maybe a reset, as we were just talking earlier. In the 17th, 18th century, China, India was about 60% of the world's output. So I think we're beginning to see the reset. It went down to a low point in the 1950s, about 5% of China, but now things are coming up. So when that happens, there's a lot of things at play, global politics and power issues, and you have to manage it carefully. You have to be very attuned to making certain it's a peaceful adjustment which is going on.
Reuben, just coming to you, because obviously your specialist area is India, and as I said before, the economic rivalry between China and India has dominated the world of the emerging markets over the last 10, 15 years, and they approach development and also economic growth in very, very different ways. I'm thinking in particular about how India has tried repeatedly to try and match China's growth in terms of percentage numbers, but in terms of infrastructure, things have been lacking. What is the difference in the model here, and why doesn't it work?
I just want to start by just re-emphasizing Khalid's point about when you talk about emerging markets, I mean, it's very useful to keep history in perspective. So the fact that these two economies were 50 to 60% of global GDP as late as 1826 is something that we need to keep in mind. And so there is a certain narrative of world history where, you know, everything starts and ends with Greece and Rome, which is just not true. I mean, there's a very large world out there that actually did very well. I mean, not on a per capita basis, but in terms of sheer size compared to the share of global GDP. In terms of India and China as economic rivals, I actually don't think there's much by way of rivalry. I mean, that battle's been won by China by leaps and bounds. I mean, if you just look at data in the 80s, I mean, India was a larger economy than China was, and China today is 5 times larger than India. So that battle's been primarily lost, at least in the short term, it's been lost. I do think that there is something to be said, and I'm not taking a position on this necessarily, but there is something to be said for the governance system. So if you are working with the constraints of a democracy, there are severe constraints that it places on you. So for instance, a highway building project, a large infrastructure project, and I say this because my parent company, we are the largest infrastructure financiers in South Asia. I mean, every highway project has 100 public interest litigations against it in the Supreme Court. So that's just the process of democracy. You've got to work it out in the system. So that process of working within the constraints of democracy is always going to place a certain barrier to growth. On top of that, obviously, we've had extraordinarily inefficient government, certainly over the last 10 years, and that has definitely played a role as well.
We'll come back to the issue of India in just a second, but I want to make sure that we include all of our panelists and also include their areas of expertise. Mario Pizzini, I want to come to you. Obviously, every time people talk about emerging markets, the first thing that jumps to their mind is their voracious growth of countries like China and India, but the reality is you focus a lot on Latin America. They're completely different areas of growth and challenges there as well. Where are the new emerging areas from the OECD's perspective?
You're right. Just to come back to some data and following what was said before, we did a quick calculation. We took the rate of growth of OECD countries, we multiplied twice, and we went to see how many countries did better. And in the 90s, we found 12 countries. There you had China, but you had Chile, you had the Dominican Republic, Malaysia, and others. The striking thing was the exercise done in the first 10 years of 2000, because the countries that did better than the double of the OECD average were not 12, were 83. As such, it takes a sense, the expression that we used at the time 4 years ago when we did this exercise, we call it shifting wealth. In reality, it's the center of gravity of the global economy which is moving. 40 years ago, in the London School of Economics, there was an exercise that positioned the barycenter in the Azores Islands. That's obvious because North Atlantic was the locomotive. Today is close to the border, the eastern border of Turkey, and is moving far towards east and the south. What are the consequences of this phenomena has already been said. In many cases, extreme poverty has been reduced. There are new workers, 1.5 billion in the global labor market with a series of consequences. But the point that you are raising is the crucial one. How much are we expecting to see new areas growing? And secondly, who are the locomotives? How long they will be sustainable? That's the real question. When we look at the phenomena, we see that China obviously played a major role. It's more than China, in fact, it was also India and others. At present, we observe a rate of growth of 5.4 for this year in Southeast Asia, 5 in Africa, and less than 3% in Latin America. This already somehow provides a quick answer to your question. Nevertheless, there are major changes taking place. The lack of growth in Europe is obviously affecting the development. China, that for internal issues is reducing the rate of growth, will have impact on the further possibility of development. But I would also add, as another element to consider to answer your question, what are the emerging challenges in the endogenous growth of this economy? And I would suggest two. The first is productivity, that in many cases, Latin America is the worst example, is flat. Growth came, productivity did not increase. And if you want to maintain your growth, you need increasing productivity. And second is social cohesion, because we are speaking of something very funny. We call it middle classes. I am very cold in using this expression. Middle classes, to me, recall when Nixon accompanied Khrushchev to see the middle classes house in the United States. There were 1 or 2 parents, 1 or 2 children, 1 or 2 cars, 1 or 2 dogs. Obviously, Khrushchev thought this was not true, it was a joke. In reality, middle classes we are talking about for emerging countries don't have a car in the 60% of cases, not 2, 1. They work in 70% of the cases in the informal economy, which means they don't have a pension. In other terms, if the firms, the local firms moves out, they cannot find a job elsewhere because they cannot move. The general, and here I conclude, the general point I'm making is that there are expectations because they have left extreme poverty, but there are frustrations because they remain vulnerable. And this may create tension in those countries.
This is something I wanted to come to with you as well. This sense of, understandably, this sense of better quality of life, better living standards in some number of these countries does fuel rising expectations. And if you're looking at some of these emerging markets, they're so densely populated, they're so enormous, it's going to be difficult to find jobs, quantity of jobs and quality of jobs that actually meets those expectations.
You're absolutely right. And here I would just follow up on what has already been said, that it's good to have this perspective of what is feasible, right? And there is the one perspective, which is you take the large economies and they rapidly growing like China will have huge impact both domestically but on the world as a whole. Then you have countries that do very well but are small, Luxembourg in Europe, high living standards, obviously very little impact economically on the rest of the world, but very high living standards, satisfying a lot of expectations. And then the second, I think, perspective that's good to add to what has been said is that there are some countries that manage to do really well for relatively long periods of time. China nowadays, East Asia generally, Chile, Latin America, decades. There are many countries, as was said, that can do well for a decade, but then not much longer. Or decade yes, decade no, decade yes, very checkered, India being a good example of that. So it's very difficult to sustain something that's going on. And so the expectations that get generated are very often frustrating because there are relatively few countries that really can sustain the momentum for a long enough time. I think the expectations have been tempered by the Great Recession, which has affected the whole world, even though some countries like China managed to, again, withstand and not be there. Nevertheless, their markets have been affected. So everybody's expectations, I think, are more tempered right now. So I think that is going to play an important part. I am of the view, and that goes back to the discussion yesterday of the labor markets, that the world economy as a whole and individual economies within it are actually quite flexible in terms of what they can create. So if the environment were propitious, then indeed one could create a lot of new jobs. And what has been done in China and the world economy in general over the last several decades is quite impressive when one ignores the Great Recession. So I think that will all depend in a way on policy, economic policy, guiding the global economy, the governance system that we will put together. And we can have very diverse experiences. In other words, the world economy could grow by leaps and bounds, and it could also not do well. Europe is a very good example. If we take it, it's an economy, it's up to Europe to lose its opportunity, and it has so far been losing it. You look at it, the potential is incredible. Human capital that is matched by very few big regions of the world. Until recently, it was the largest economic area in the world. It got surpassed by the US now because of the stagnation that's been in Europe. But, it's an example of a country that, or continent, but let's say an economy, integrated economy, that has not managed to realize its potential, right? One that I think is a really very exciting emerging market economy is the United States. It's an economy that has gone through a very tough period, but a good friend of mine is the chief design sort of person for research and development at Ford Motor Company. As they were going through the incredibly tough period of the Great Recession, these guys were innovating, inventing and innovating at an incredibly fast pace. And it's not an exception, it's an illustration. So you have economies like that that don't look like they are going to be really poised for major things. But I would not underestimate the United States in terms of the innovation, invention, and the impact on the world it will have. And if you look at the flows of talent of people around the world, the great thing that we see now compared to the past is that it goes in many directions. So it's being spread globally. But the single largest flow goes to the United States.
That's a very interesting point, which I'm going to come back to. I suppose the economic American dream, if you like, and what it's turning into today. But I just want to home in on the business community with you, Santiago. It was so interesting what Jan Svenja was talking about there about investing in human capital, using your human capital as a country, and investing in innovation and technology. That requires confidence from companies. It requires them to put money aside to hire people. You're an entrepreneur in a fast-growing market. Do you have the confidence to invest in these projects at the moment?
I think you're talking about confidence. Indonesia, where I come from, is one of the highest. I think Nielsen is actually here in the audience. One of the highest, most confident, has a highest consumer confidence in the world. We are pretty much a growing economy. Right now, the third engine of the growth in Asia after China and India, 250 million people. You're looking at basically a market that is half of Southeast Asia. And I think company is now looking to invest because I think we just had a very successful elections. And back in 1998, when I started my business, nobody had high expectations on Indonesia. Cars were burning on the street. And we just ended a 32-year of authoritarian regime. One, I guess, consultant said that Indonesia will not make it because it's too large, it's too fragmented, too many islands, too uneducated. But look at Indonesia 15 years from the day of the Asian financial crisis. Not only it has full-fledged democracy, we just had a very successful elections. We're a growing economy, and this is a showcase whereby democracy, Islam, modernity and progress can be showcased at the same time. So I think business is very optimistic. I guess middle class is growing. We are forming about 100 million middle class that would show up in the next 5 to 10 years. It's a big electronic market. Everybody is on social media. My neighbor gardener is actually on Facebook. My driver have 3 handphones, 3 mobile phones. I hope he doesn't have 3 wives, but he had 3 mobile phones and constantly updating status on social media. And I think that's pretty much showing where I guess middle income has grown and poverty alleviations have pretty much been addressed. So in short, yes, we're very confident, and we think the economy will continue to grow.
But share, if you started your company back in the 80s, share with us, if you please, your experiences of the Asian financial crisis, because as we just heard before from Jan Svenja, the one thing emerging markets seem to be very good at is weathering crises because they're so flexible, they have such youthful labor markets, etc.
Yeah, I think one thing is it's a young demography. We have close to 50% plus of our populations below the age of 30. So it's quite flexible. We believe crisis always presents opportunity. And when I started my investment firm, everybody thinks that we're out of our mind. We're mad. Everybody's rushing out of the country. You're putting money into the country. But what we're seeing is basically this large economies would produce long-term sustainable above-market return for company that pretty much focus on the medium to long-term. So we focus on sectors such as natural resources. When Asia would recover from its crisis in 98, 99, the first thing they would need is energy. So we focus on energy, and I think GDF Suez is actually investing together also in the country and seeing tremendous growth in the country the past 5 years after the crisis. So after that would be infrastructures. We're seeing telecom, roads. You're talking about how bad infrastructures in some of the emerging areas. Here we are in Indonesia is facing the same. The average speed on a car moving in Jakarta is below 10 kilometers an hour. Some of you probably run faster than 10 kilometers an hour. So that infrastructures will be also an opportunity. And the third space that is growing very fast is the consumers. And you see a demanding middle income countries would present itself a consumer that behave differently also. They want the best product at a cheap rate, fast. If not, then they complain in terms of their social media. We invest in an airline. There's a delay. The first thing we know is by Twitter or Facebook that they report that there is a delay, and all the way goes to the CEO as well as to the shareholders. And this is the behavior of the middle income, and I think companies have to adapt. Government have to adapt and see how the progress on the rise of the middle income is presenting itself.
So that sense of expectation is very keenly felt. I'm going to be coming back to you, Reuben Abraham, here for a second. The whole idea of decentralization into these cities, it's really interesting. I was reading a McKinsey report that said that these city-states in a number of these emerging economies, but also big city countries around the world, they're almost as countries. They should be viewed as countries by companies, by governments. Even in the UK, where I come from, we've now got this big talk of decentralization. Is that the future here, do you think?
I mean, that's a very interesting question. So let's just look at some data first. So if you look at this globally, about 70% of global GDP comes from just 40 urban regions. So the largest of which is the eastern seaboard of the United States, the eastern seaboard of China, et cetera, et cetera. So the question you've got to ask is, so for instance, you know, I mean, I don't know how many people are familiar with the C40 negotiations, for instance. So the underlying logic of C40 is, if 70% of output is coming from 40 urban regions, why are we having the climate discussion at the national level? Why don't we instead have the discussion at the city level, where the mayor of Shanghai probably has much more in common with the mayor of New York than he does with, you know, when you take national interests into account. So the question is, can you decentralize one level below without giving up on national sovereignty? And that's a very interesting discussion because, you know, we shouldn't forget that before Westphalia, you know, there were a lot of city-states. You know, the Hanseatic League was a league of city-states and so on. So it's an interesting conversation. So, but the important thing there is, and I speak from an Indian perspective here, which is for that to happen efficiently, the power needs to be devolved from the national level to the city level. So even in England, outside of London, there aren't really empowered mayors. So you need to have a lot more mayors who are actually powerful to be able to do things at the city level. So that's an important prerequisite for this sort of movement to take place. But it's a very interesting trend. I mean, it's a very interesting trend, and I do believe that a lot of pressing issues can actually be addressed.
Khalid Malik, what do you think about that? Because if you're such an expert in China, you spent so much time in China, that is one of the places in the world with the biggest urban concentrations in some of its megacities, but of course it's so centralized in terms of the power base.
Actually, China is not centralized.
No, but
you know, there's a saying that the sky is high and the emperor is far, which basically means that for a very long time, not just recently, people always did things their own way at the provincial and country and the city, the subnational level. I think that the challenge is, how do you think of urbanization in a way which works? China actually is not that highly urbanized. It's beginning to start now. It's only 50% population in urban areas. In the next 20 years, it's going to shift. But that's what I meant by 300 million people moving from rural to urban areas. And of course, when you congregate, your per capita emissions go down. There are all kinds of issues which are positive issues. You have to accommodate, but there's also other issues. You have to create new cities. You have to actually increase the footprint a little bit. So you have an intersect situation of urbanization. It's a big phenomenon. But then you have to also remember that 3/4 of the world's poverty is actually in agriculture areas. And when we do work in Africa, for instance, the Africans always tell us, do not forget agriculture and do not forget rural areas. Because if you simply allow urbanization to happen the way the trends are being projected, you're actually compounding the problem, not solving things. And given what is happening on internet and the whole question of being able to do things in a different way, there's an opportunity here of reviving agriculture in a way which actually enhances people's lives as well.
Let me just ask Maria Pizzini to weigh in on this subject.
I may jump in because there are some data that we have elaborated. Let me start with the general consideration, looking at Mr. Fitoussi. Economists are destroyed in their thinking by averages, and we need to get out of averages. In fact, when we look at territories, we realize how poor is the representation that we have of them. And sometimes I have the feeling that we are moving now from points, countries, to other points that are cities, but we forget what is actually happening in the space. In the OECD, we talk the metropolitan areas, not cities, metropolitan areas with more than 1.5 million inhabitants. And we try to measure the GDP per capita. What you observe is that up to 6 million people, there is a direct correlation between size of the city and GDP per capita. When you pass the 6 million, it reverses. What does it mean? That city in itself is not necessarily always the best way to organize life and the economy, that therefore we have to take into account also other possibility of development. Germany is not a country with big cities, nor the north of Europe, or Italy, or Spain. In reality, the story of big metropolitan areas is very specialized in certain areas in the world. As a consequence, I think we have to take into account the region, the space, and the rural areas. But also why? Because we tend to identify rural areas with agriculture, and therefore we say if modernization means bringing people from agriculture to industry, from extended family to nuclear family, from artisanal production to industrial production, therefore that's what needs to happen. In the OECD countries, you take rural areas and you measure how many people work in agriculture. Out of 100 people working, 5 people work in agriculture. The rest of 95 do other jobs. So I think there is a strong play from this data to consider a wider perspective, and therefore decentralization would be particularly evident.
I just want to, in the spirit of debate, I just want to take on both of these issues. So the first piece is this notion of urbanization being associated with large cities. I think that's just a complete fallacy, because if you look at the definitions of urban globally, the most onerous definition of urban is actually in India. And the most onerous definition of urbanization in the world gives you 5,000 people living at a density of 400 people per square kilometer. So it's not large cities at all that we're talking about. So in fact, this is very important to point out that when we say urbanization, we don't mean mega cities. It's a range of options all the way from 20,000 people to 20 million people living in a city. Now, there you can have optimal sizes, etc., for which, you know, I mean, I think that kind of research is very, very useful to know what is the optimal size for a city. That's number one. And then the other point...
Is there an optimal size for a city, though, really?
Well, I don't know one.
There is no one.
There is no...
That would be my guess, that there is no optimal size, but I'm willing to consider that, you know, if there's research done. On the poverty and agriculture issue, I'll push back on that, because the reason why they're poor is because agricultural productivity is really low, which basically means there's too many people engaged in a sector that just produces too little of GDP. So if you look at India, for instance, you've got 50% of the population in the agricultural sector, which produces 13% of GDP. So in effect, what you actually need to do is to get people out of agriculture, preferably into manufacturing and industrialization, and the spatial expression of manufacturing is urbanization.
Well, even here in France, agriculture is a very emotive
in the spirit of debate. I think, you know, we have economists and planners have been stuck with history pretending as theory. I think, you know, there's the whole idea that the only way to develop is to take people out of agriculture or rural areas into urban areas. But if you really look into this thing more carefully, you realize that there are many different models you can pursue. Take the case of East Punjab with West Punjab. Very interesting cases. West Punjab, which is in Pakistan, used to be the granary of the whole of India. Fast forward 30 years, the situation has reversed itself. Same people, same soil conditions, and the productivity of land in East Punjab is 2 to 3 times higher than West Punjab. In the case of Africa, productivity has been constant for the last 40 years, has not changed. But Asia has demonstrated you can do these things. The question remains, we should be very careful to pursue theories in way which do not benefit people. We really have to look at what helps people's lives the most. And you have to try different strategies. And one part of the strategy has to be empowering people in the way they live. Of course, bring a certain amount of concentration there, a certain amount of facilities there, and certain amount of manufacturing processing which allows the agriculture sector to do better. I mean, there are many examples of that in other cases.
Well, we haven't yet had a chance to get into Africa, and we should be talking about Africa. Africa suffers from, some might argue, the pressures in certain cities, but not enough infrastructure to create big enough, powerful enough national and city economies. In your research, what have you been turning up on Africa for the future?
Well, the fascinating thing about Africa is, the 7 to 10 fastest growing countries, economies in the world are now African economies. But the reality is they're not producing sufficient number of jobs when you compare them with East Asia at comparable levels of development. And it is all connected. You cannot just look at cities. You have to look at the whole economy. Even if you accept the whole idea of moving from agriculture to urban areas, you still have to then account for the population as a whole. And when you have people in Africa who are simply congregating into big cities, adding to slums, the conditions of life are degraded quite a lot. But equally in agriculture, they're barely eking existence. Something has to change.
What do you think the answer is then?
Well, the answer
is
is...
$1 trillion question, but...
Actually, Ethiopia is an interesting example. Ethiopia has invested very heavily in modernization. But equally, they're trying very hard to modernize agriculture itself, to find ways of trying different models, large farms, small farms. If you look at the way agriculture has developed in most countries in the world, very few countries have developed without subsidies in agriculture. And this is precisely what the IMF and the World Bank were telling African countries not to do. And the countries which have subsidized agriculture have done quite well. So they have now started subsidizing agriculture, and you can see agriculture production going up. So my recommendation to policymakers is listen to your own people, listen to what is the reality, and don't worry too much about getting advice from well-meaning experts. Huh?
Yeah, let me just come to Jan first, and then I'll ask you.
So I think this is all useful. I would just point out that the agglomeration that we see and the benefits of it, whether it's medium-sized, larger or smaller cities, and that may differ on the local conditions, is important for two reasons. One is, as was pointed out, people move from low productivity to higher productivity types of activities, and that's important. The other thing is the importance of spillovers, that really being closer to each other in terms of investments, in terms of human capital, Santiago pointed out, it's very important, and so you have actually a second effect which is very strong, and that I think is important. The related thing is that the world economy now, even at the local level, is much more based on flows rather than stocks. What I mean by that is that capital moves, and people have many more jobs during their lifetime than their parents or grandparents that often were in one position most of their life, right? So the trick, the question for good policy in that sense is, how do you achieve stability when you're based on flows rather than stocks? When things are moving, you're in moving sands, right? And that's where some countries that do well are really good at that, whether consciously or subconsciously, and others are not, right? And one more thing, which goes back to Santiago, what is helpful in a number of contexts is if you have young population, because they're dynamic, they are accessible, they are able to change, they are more flexible. And in fact, it's not just phenomenon now. When you look at Europe in the 1950s, the German miracle was, to a large extent, it was a demographically young country, right? And you see that as you examine it all over and over in the world. And Indonesia is a good example nowadays.
2 points. The first about the question of agglomeration. Economists tend to think that there is something called economy of agglomeration. And if you put together firms and people in the same place, this will increase magically productivity. We are very much like Aristotle, that the fire is burning because it has a burning force. I think that we have to explain economy of agglomeration. Putting together people and just opposing firms doesn't create in itself more productivity. It does if you have certain public goods. In Mexico City, when in 73 there were 3 million people and today 22 million people, it takes 3 hours for certain people to go to work and 3 hours to come back. If they do not have the public goods, which is a system of transport that makes sense, then the mechanism doesn't work. So, I totally agree, and that's what we have to think about. Chinese are doing it. In other places, this is not happening. But a second point that was already appeared in the past. in the discussion. There is a country in North Africa that for 10 years have 5% of growth. A deficit that was minus 3%, so Maastricht criteria. A debt of 42.8%, much less than the best European country. This country had very high level of enrollment in primary school, and the investment in school was relatively good in general. Which country I'm talking about? Tunisia, before the Arab Spring. So in itself, the fact that you have growth, the fact that you have a school, doesn't guarantee the results. Why? Because Africa, you were speaking about Africa, is the continent where we have the highest concentration of youth, and in 2004, 2 million more of youth will be there. The point is that they are asking for jobs, and in the north they are unemployed, and in the south underemployed. So the matter is not only injecting education, it's the industrial demand. And at present, the agricultural demand. The industrial demand is concentrated in certain areas that are not producing jobs, such as mineral production. So here, 2 days ago, the president of the African Union on this stage said what is required for Africa is productive transformation, industrial policies.
It requires changes in education as well to meet the kind of jobs
but not
that are on
alone.
offer.
Not alone. If not, you will create expectation and frustration, as it was the case in Tunisia, represented symbolically from a guy that went to school, didn't find a job, and then went to sell vegetables on the street.
But even in developed economies like here in Europe, we have a constant problem with trying to match the students coming out of university with the jobs that are on offer by the time that they finish their degrees. This brings me to you, Santiago, just quickly. In Indonesia, in a country that is fastly growing, more and more people are more educated, as you said. They're coming to work for companies like yours.
Yeah, I think we're talking about growth, and I'd like to pick up on what Mario said. Growth doesn't really mean that it would produce stability. I think we're seeing, at least in the Indonesian economy as well as in other countries as well, that we're growing pretty rapidly, but our Gini ratio is actually also increasing. So we have to be very careful. And I think this is where the business community needs to play a role. We need to identify all the potential hotspots because what really happened in Tunisia could also happen in Indonesia. And therefore, I guess businesses with disruptive innovations, and you're talking about agricultural, for the 20, 30, 40 years in Indonesia and many other economies of the world have been doing the same thing over and over again. And it's like insanity, meaning that you do things the same way, you're expecting a different result. That's insanity. Now, you need business to come up, entrepreneurs who come up with technology that disrupt the ways of doing things. Many point out to how Uber taxi is disrupting the transportation industry, how e-commerce is disrupting the way people trade. And this is what actually are taking place in the food and energy sectors in Indonesia. You mentioned about agricultural. Food would be a big opportunity for business to find innovations, infrastructures, energy. We have about 100 million of Indonesians with very limited access to electricity. I used to support Earth Hour. Earth Hour is a day, I think in March every year, whereby you would say, switch off your light for 1 hour to actually give support to Mother Earth. So because I have a Twitter that has about 250,000 followers, I've been asked to tweet basically saying that please switch off your light between 8:30 to 9:30 to give Mother Earth support. So I tweeted, and within very short period of time, people from north part of Sumatra saying that, oh, we're having Earth Hour every day because we have no access to electricity. It's not just today. And some people from eastern Indonesia saying that, well, our Earth Hour is actually happening every other day. So basically, these are the opportunities that business needs to address. And I think with disruptive way of how we look at these opportunities, we can find solutions. Just final point on the growth as well as Gini ratio. We're also experiencing in Indonesia a disruptive way on the politics arena, because in the past, politics are always being dominated by the elite. Only in the last few years that Indonesian politics have been disrupted predominantly by new politicians with really innovative ideas on how to embrace the people. So for the very first time today, Jakarta, which was in 1998, was so fearsome to the Chinese community, would have a Chinese ethnic minority Christian governor in Jakarta. It's totally unthinkable even 5 years ago. Why? Because he listens to the people. He comes to the community, and we call it an impromptu visits to listen to what the people are saying. Now, this is a brand new politics. It is only able because we have disruptive politicians who challenge pretty much the elite with a new way of innovative politics. And I think this is probably something that we need to be alert.
Jan Svenja, let me come to you here. They say never waste a good crisis as an opportunity for bringing change about. And we've heard time and time again about how these Gini coefficients are rising, even in the developed world, places like the UK where I come from. Inequality, are we currently at a tipping point here? When we talk about all these opportunities here in these big cities, the reality is that inequality is getting stark by the day.
Absolutely. No, I think that's one of the big issues of the day today is inequality in many respects. One is, income inequality. But there is a very important wealth inequality issue. We've been recently doing research on the effect of billionaire wealth or concentration of wealth as opposed to income at the top. And it seems that it, on average, has a negative effect, although one has to distinguish. It turns out that crony capitalism, in other words, if a lot of wealth is concentrated at the top in the hands of people who obtained it not because of their acumen, talent, and capabilities, then it has a disastrously negative effect. The other one is more positive or not negative, let's say, okay? So one has to, I think, look much more deeply into what type of inequality is driving what. Generally, it is true that we've reached a point where I think large swaths of the population are really fed up with the what they consider unfair distribution and becomes counterproductive. On the other hand, obviously makes sense to have the entrepreneurs who turn very rich in the sense of their personal wealth, so long as their contribution to the social welfare is many, many times greater, of course.
And this brings me to the world of technology, which you were mentioning before, albeit in the context of an enormous company like Ford Motor Company. But the reality is we've got small startups all over the world that are being bought and sold for billions, and they're not creating an awful lot of jobs. Even in America, which, as you said, is the new emerging place again, or re-emerging place.
That is true, and I think that this is a very important part. To what extent is the technology creating fewer jobs than in the past? I think that it's not the case. The American economy over the long period of time is a good example where growing and growing by creating jobs very, very steadily. I think currently we have a problem where we are actually not growing fast enough in many parts of the world, and that's creating the unemployment rate. If you take the advanced economies, where we have the data over decades, and look back, during the crises, big recessions, let's say in the 1980s, before the new technology connected with internet and so on came into being, unemployment rates, including youth unemployment rates, were similar to what we have now. Okay? So it's not like what we observe today is somehow new and due to changes, etc. Great Depression in the 1930s, even higher unemployment rates, right? So despite major technological changes and restructuring of economies, it's really economic growth that determines to a large extent whether we have relatively full or not employment in the more advanced economies. In the developing countries, in the traditional sense, you can't measure unemployment. So there is just a question of underemployment. How fully do you utilize, people and so on, their productivity and so on. I would not worry so much really about the small firms not producing enough employment. In general, they do. The statistics indicate that small firms do tend to be more labor intensive. And if they grow rapidly, then they obviously create a lot of jobs, as some of the large firms that started as small ones, amply indicate. Usually high productivity, high wage, and good working condition type jobs. So that, I think, would be a very, very positive type situation if we can get into it.
Actually, when you look at the US economy, it is generating jobs, this is correct, but not the right kind of jobs. A lot of short-term jobs, a lot of informal jobs, and which do not have the right kind of social protections and things like that. And I think the reality of the US condition is that one should not over-romanticize what's happening in the US. Joe Stiglitz produced this book recently on the price of inequality, and basically showed that when inequality reaches a certain tipping point, the level of aggregate demand is no longer at that point where it can sustain consumption levels which will then sustain growth. So it's really, the question you have to ask is what kind of growth you're talking about. And I had mentioned yesterday an eminent economist, Tony Atkinson, compared two decades, 80s and the 90s. 80s were considered to be a very good decade, growth rates. And 90s were considered not so good. But the minute you adjust it by a factor of inequality, it actually reverses. So you really have to ask, what is the bottom 40% of the population doing? And when you look at that, the worrisome thing about the US experience is that education inequality is spreading, which has intergenerational consequences. So there are a lot of issues I think one has to be careful about. And the reality is that the high-tech, the bigger companies are not generating sufficient jobs. And the small and medium enterprise are not getting sufficient support from the system. So you have a lot of structural challenges in the US.
Look, I agree with that, but I think, again, we have to temper it by the changes that are taking place that should be also included. And one thing is that the fact that people nowadays don't hold one job, but hold many jobs, accounts in part for what we observe in the United States, that there are jobs that are created that don't necessarily last all the time. And you're right, we have problems that a lot of the jobs are of the sort of low-wage nature, but there are also jobs that are created that are of the high-wage nature. Those are there as well. And Santiago, and those are good examples of people who do that. The second thing I think that's really important is to sort of realize that the U.S. has been not growing very fast. And in periods of rapid growth, that nature changes of the jobs and employment changes dramatically, right? So we are going through a tough period. We have to realize that the advanced economies are just not in a state which would be traditionally considered normal. Now, it may be the new normal going forward, which would be really difficult to swallow and to live with. But the question is, will it be the new normal or will there be more rapid growth?
Mario Bettini, let me just quickly come to you. Time and time again, journalists like myself watch the US President Barack Obama arrive at, say, an Amazon distribution facility saying, we're here to support their initiative to create X number of new jobs. And the reality is that, as you were just saying before, Jan Svenja, is that those people probably have two jobs. The American dream isn't really saleable to the American people anymore. How is that going to affect the world economy? Because the American dream that you just mentioned there all those years ago in the Cold War isn't the same proposition as it once was.
That's true, but if I can just say, when I came to the United States in 1970s, the American dream was dead. The sociology class, Sociology 101, was teaching how you could no longer have billionaires, you could no longer rise, right? This was now a stable, stagnant society, and you could read Horatio Alger's and learn how things were at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, but there was no hope. Right? Now we have all these poor jobs, etc., but we also have examples of people who made it, and frankly, all my students are driven enormously at the professional schools to succeed the way the success cases are here. Not all of them will, obviously, and not all of them do, but the expectations, the motivations, the amount of effort that they provide is mind-boggling.
Now, if your question, therefore, was how this dream may apply also to other countries, and in developing countries, I would like to go back to your original question that was about Gini, and then we made the switch, Gini employment, what is happening with employment. Why I would like to go back? Because there is another factor that is important to call into play. We measured the Gini in Latin American countries before and after taxes. And we did, obviously, in OECD countries. What you observe in the OECD countries is that there is a big difference between before taxes and after taxes. In Latin America, almost no difference. Now, when you try to explain this phenomena, there is an immediate information that comes into play. In Colombia, today, even after 2 reforms of taxes, the fiscal revenue is around 15% of GDP. In OECD countries, 35%. In Peru, it's even worse. The same in Central America. With the exception, in other terms, of Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, the percentages are much lower. The same applies to Indonesia, the same applies to many African countries, not all, but to many African countries. The point I am saying is that reducing inequalities comes through jobs for sure, but not only. It comes also through policies. In fact, if we look in the world, what are the countries that have been the most successful in reducing inequality, now they were starting from high level, is Brazil and Turkey. What Brazil is doing to do so? We always refer to Bolsa Familia and the conditional cash transfer mechanism. They are absolutely crucial. Nevertheless, Brazil reached this result also through minimum wages that were hired and active policy to create jobs. So the mechanism that reduces inequalities has a lot to do with public policies. Now, as we observe different patterns of growth and policy in different countries, I'm not sure the dream today is only one, but there are several ones. Now, just a little addition about quality of growth. I totally agree that also in terms of growth, we don't have one model, but different type of growth. You mentioned before the difference between China and India. One may talk about South Africa or talk about Brazil and other countries. Now, for sure, there is a pattern of growth that presents problems in many developing countries. And is a very disseminated pattern, which is the one based on natural resources, non-renewable. Because there you find the Dutch disease that was not invented in developing countries, as you know, and you witness here. And practically, I'm referring to the fact that you export, the price grows, the rate of exchange increases. Those that are in the competitive sector gain, also in terms of wages. They buy more pizzas, and therefore also the sector, I hope pizzas, also the sector of protected services will benefit. But in the middle, the manufacturing jobs are squeezed because they are exposed to international competition, and then they cannot make it. This pattern of growth will create society that will be more and more polarized and dualist. This pattern is creating problems, for sure, in the midterm.
Do you have an answer to that, Reuben?
Well, I don't necessarily have an answer to that particular issue, but I think it's important to, I'm not trivializing the inequality debate, but there was a time of great equality. And the time of great equality, for instance, in China, was in the 60s and 70s, when there were 700 million more people living below the poverty line. So, you know, one mustn't forget the fact that, yes, a lot of people have been pulled out of poverty, and in the process, there is inequality that's created. But that's a trade-off there. I mean, you know, a truly equal society is a society where everybody is poor. I mean, that's not an ideal outcome either.
Oh, I'm not sure everybody in the room would agree with you. Please go ahead and take that.
I think one great thing about Reuben is that he kind of lays it out there. But let me give you some specific details about the Chinese experience. China, about late 70s, was quite equal in terms of assets and education. So when they opened up markets, most people benefited. And poverty went down dramatically in the 80s and 90s. 2000 onward, when the inequality started going up, actually poverty reduction slowed down tremendously. So it is actually a big mistake to think that this is a somehow trade-off issue here. There isn't any trade-off issue fundamentally. And there's enough empirical evidence to show that you can have your cake and eat it too. And it's necessary to do that. Look at Pulse Familia program in Brazil. As a percentage of the budget, it's a very small percentage, but it's lifted 40% of the population, put them into the middle class, and increase the tax base. So you have an issue of inequality coming down, and in a sense laying the basis for growth in the future.
But that is in one generation. Still, the jury's out on how exactly that will transform future generations of Brazilians.
Well, the Brazilian case is actually about future generations because it's a conditional cash transfer. And you transfer payments because on condition of investing in education for children. So that is a future generation issue. Huh?
You know, I'm familiar with the Bolsa Familia program, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is that in many of these developing countries, governments, systems change radically over the course of 2 or 3 generations. And so when it comes to countries like Brazil fighting potentially, a lot of people in Brazil will talk to you about the hyperinflation in the 1990s and how concerned they are about that. That's a recurring theme in some of these emerging markets. And when it comes to these programs, they need many tens of years to actually really change a country, don't they?
Well, first of all, these are programs. They do not necessarily cover the entire population. And they're only one set of programs. Many other things are needed. In Brazil, for instance, there's a lot of red tape in terms of entrepreneurial activity, and it's very difficult for groups to make easy progress. If you look at China, China was actually very clear for a long time that private sector has a big role to play. Of course, they didn't follow any of the guidelines, the bank and others. They just did it their own way. And they seem to have done it well. So I think there's no single recipe for success. You really have to ground it in country realities. You see what's going on in your country. When we did for the 2013 report, we did a lot of empirical work on seeing why do some countries do better than others in the context of globalization. And the answer was actually very straightforward. Countries do well when they invest in people and infrastructure. Then they benefit from globalization. Where they do not do that, they get hurt by it. So they are actually rather straightforward approaches to this matter as well.
I'm just going to come back to the issue of China because you prompted something in my mind that I wanted to mention before. Now, this may be a very, very simplistic way of putting things, but a lot of people I interview on my show will say, why is China not growing at the same rate as it was before? And they say, well, you know, there's only so many motorways and universities you can build. What is the future like for China? Because it seems so it's very, very difficult to understand China, where China's going, economically speaking, politically speaking, what its people actually want.
Well, actually, 2-3 points one can make. The first one is that 7.5% of the second largest economy is far more important to the world than 10% of a small economy. And financial markets constantly forget about this. So they obsess about 7.4, 7.2% as if this is the earth-shattering moment, when it isn't. Actually, it's a great plus. So I think that's fine. The Chinese also have this great ability to, once they set a target, to actually achieve it. And I'll give you an example. In 2007, 2008, when the Great Recession happened, the World Bank reduced the estimates of GDP growth in China to 6.5%. And I did an op-ed piece at that time saying, I think they will meet the 8% target, because the Chinese have a great ability to mobilize the whole administrative infrastructure and banking systems to make that happen. And they won 8.2%. So that's the first point in economics. The second point is that over 600 million people, the Chinese are well educated now. Almost 80 to 100 million people travel overseas as tourists every year. So like it or not, it's a huge force for change. There are 600 million people on the web, tremendous pressure on city officials. And you had this case a few years ago where in Tianjin, which is next to Beijing, there was a big train accident. And the first instinct of Chinese local leaders was to bury the train. Imagine trying to bury a train. You have to get caterpillars and machines to do that. It was recorded, put on the web, and the Prime Minister had to go personally to promise a objective audit and get people in prison and things like that. So I think, like it or not, that's the future. The relationship between the citizen state is changing quite rapidly in China. Citizens expect more for the system, to be treated with dignity, with transparency, and this is a force of history. And governance systems have to adapt to it. And whether they adapt now or later, there's no choice. Because people are educated, quite media savvy, and quite connected globally. They know what's going on. So you cannot stop that anymore. I think the genie is out of the bottle on that one.
I fully agree with that, and so let me just add a few points to illustrate. I first went to China in 1983, so it was very early when the reform started, and we were one of the first groups to be allowed to go into enterprises of all sizes and actually interview workers and do all that. And, you know, the development since then is just tremendous, and you look at the data, I think quibbling about whether the economy grows 7.5 or 7.2 is totally ridiculous because, you know, you even have examples a few years ago when the regions submitted their GDPs to the center, and the center said that's too high. It says, oh, okay. And they submitted adjusted numbers, which were just what the center, you know, said the economy was growing. So, you know, that I think is really, you know, besides the point. But what I think is important, which I don't have an answer to, but I'd like to bring to the floor, is that while economists are relatively sanguine about China in terms of not growing 12%, but, you know, 7.5 is still very, very impressive for the long run. The colleagues who are more worried or apprehensive are the colleagues from the political science departments. They see risk and uncertainty. They say, look, unlike India, which is a well-established democracy, may have a lot of economic problems here and there, China has a big unresolved issue. What kind of a political system and political economy will it have going forward for the decades? And that could affect whether it will have this rate of growth or have a major convulsion or not, right? And if it succeeds in proceeding with the current system, then I think it poses a question for the rest of the world, because it's going to be the dominant economy with a dominant political system, right? And is our system going to be the one that's still going to be, you know, democracy with limited corruption, limited sort of, you know, type of activities, or is it going to be a different model if that model in fact succeeds and continues?
I'm glad we got to this, because this is a crucial point, isn't it? And earlier on when we were talking about China being centralized, decentralized, I accidentally made a slip of the tongue. I said centralized, but what I mean is controlled, really. And it's a question of whether the governance that we have is really the model that should be exported to other countries around the world. What do you think, Reuben?
What do you mean by we?
Well, so there we go. We sitting here in Europe, but yes, countries like the EU, the UK, the Western world, Western capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, so just to go back to Jan's point, I think it's an incredibly important point, and it's actually not just true of China alone, because it's actually true of all emerging markets, which is that we concentrate too much on the economic changes that are afoot, and rarely do we talk about the social changes. And the social changes, if you ask me, are actually far more interesting and far more important than the economic changes, which is that what the West had 100 years to deal with by way of social change are being compressed into 10-year time frames in these countries. So, for instance, what are the social consequences of urbanization? What happens when rural norms run up against urban norms?
But presumably, why do we ignore that? Is it because it's harder to quantify? Is it because it's harder to draft policy for that people actually vote for?
It's a good question. I mean, that may well be the reason why, but you can't ignore it, because, you know, I mean, so if you look at the caste system in India, one of the most incredible ways in which the caste system is being destroyed is actually urbanization. As people move into cities, you no longer actually have a choice in terms of who you're standing next to in a train. You don't have a choice. So there are these factors at work on the social side, which are, you know, I mean, I think are really, quite frankly, quite interesting. In terms of your question, which I haven't answered, you know, I think the jury is out. Certainly, if you make the comparison between India and China, there is a certain response that you can come to based on the evidence you have today. But you still can't predict how the situation will look like 10 years from now, which is the most stable system. I don't know.
Go ahead, Santiago.
you talk about whether the right sets of not only government but also a way of doing things here in Europe could be exported. I think the magic word is adaptability or adjustment. You talk about American dreams, and the American dreams is owning what Mario said, a house, one wife and 2 kids, and 2 dogs. The equivalent of the Indonesian dream used to be to own a motorcycle. We invested in a motorcycle distributions company, but then it evolves. People adapt. Now they want cellular mobile phone, and they don't only want one because they want 2, because one cellular provider is weak in certain areas in terms of coverage, but so they want 2. And now they are evolving now to owning a car. They want to own a car. So it's adapting the way they eat. They used to have a bowl of rice, then they graduated to noodles. Now they're on to pizza, hopefully, Mario. The only problem is I used to invest in a pizza company many years ago. The best-selling product out of the pizza company is actually fried chicken. McDonald's in Indonesia sells more fried chicken than Big Mac or Quarter Pounder, or here called Le Royale. And basically, that's the case. So you need to adapt, especially also with the government. There's no one size fits all. There's no one formula that would fit. In Indonesia case, it's 17,000 islands, very fragmented. We did the political reform and decentralizations at the same place. Everybody's saying that you can't do that. You cannot do full-fledged democracy and decentralizations. It took place, and with some adjustments. And I think it's exciting times in Asia and other parts of the world. There's a lot of moving, and I'm, as an entrepreneur, enjoying it because that's opportunity.
Santiago, you can hear, I suppose everybody in the room here can hear your optimism for Indonesia's growing economy. I presume that, you know, you're focused very much on your domestic market at the moment, but eventually there'll come a time when, you know, the domestic market either won't be enough or it'll slow down and you'll be looking at trade with other countries around the world. This brings me to the whole issue of trade and the important role of the G20, which is becoming so much more vocal in demanding a bigger seat at the table here. How do you view trade with emerging countries like Indonesia and other countries around the world? How key is that to investing for you?
I think we're part of G20 now, and we're seeing, yes, our domestic economy is growing, but at one point of time, we cannot be complacent. We need to look at China, India, Europe, our traditional trading partners, and we're seeing more and more our policies, products, and business needs to adapt also not only to China, because China is slowing down now in terms of raw material. Now I have to visit India now, because India is buying a lot of energy products from Indonesia. So I think trade is very important. Investment will follow trade. And as a businessman, we need to adapt very quickly. And as government, Indonesia sits at number 120 something on the ease of doing business by IFC report. We can't afford to have that kind of ranking. We need to catapult ourselves to top 50 because we're G20. We need to make sure that it's very, very flexible and conducive climate for people to trade and do business.
Some numbers trade. Trade used to be between the north and the south, but the patterns have changed very dramatically. South-south trade and north-north trade are roughly similar now, 30% of the global trade. 60% of China's trade is within Asia. So you see a very dramatic shift in trading patterns. And this will only accelerate. By 2030, 2/3 of the world's middle class is coming from Asia. So you can see a tectonic shift. You know, I liken this to if the Industrial Revolution, by the way, people did numbers on it, affected 100 million people. What we are seeing now is actually a couple of billion people's story. People are better educated, they're more connected. I mentioned that 80 to 100 million Chinese go overseas as tourists. So, you know, the whole world is kind of in a state of flux, beginning to reconnect in terms of typically you had airlines going from developing countries to developed countries. Now you need airline connection between developing countries themselves. So things are for play. I think if you're an entrepreneur, this is very exciting times. Opportunities everywhere.
Do you think that the trade bodies that we have at the moment, the organs of trade and organizations like the WTO, the G20, are they doing a good job of harnessing this opportunity, defending some countries?
I think we have also highlighted in our global reports that the world governance is running far behind what the realities are. And what you see is that we have 20th century institutions for 21st century realities. And many things are just not fitting. The public goods issues which Mario raised, which is absolutely needed, and I'll give you a very specific example of that, is not being provided easily. I mean, even the case of Syria, drought was one of the drivers of what happened. Something like 2 to 3 million farmers were pushed from rural to urban areas without jobs in urban areas, and that contributed to what finally happened. So lack of a climate change agreement is critical. The same is true of the Doha Development Round. It's stuck, has been stuck for many years. The G20, actually, you have to also realize that it only represents 20 countries. 173 countries are not represented. So there's a legitimacy issue. And this is one of the reasons, if you notice, the G20 process kind of slowed down and it's not really pushing either policies or initiatives at this stage.
Mario Patino, I know you want to say something about domestic demand, but let me just open up the floor to take a few questions. If anybody has a question, could you please raise your hand and a microphone will come towards you. If you could also identify who you are. I understand that we'll also have some questions from some students at Columbia and Sciences Po here. No, we have one at the back there. If we could have a microphone over there and then one at the front here. Thanks. If I could ask you to kindly identify yourselves and say clearly who you're asking the question to. Thanks.
Sure. My name is Oscar Pocasanger. I'm a student at Columbia. And I just wanted to dig into the issue that Professor Sveiner brought to the table, which is this mismatch between economic and political development. And we've seen in a lot of these emerging markets, there's a lot of economic development, but we haven't seen much institutional or political development. And I was just wondering, is the growth we're seeing in emerging markets, is it sustainable? Is it long-term growth if we don't see the political systems reacting to these economic changes? And if so, like, if not, like, how can the political system react to it or disrupt it, as in Indonesia, for example? Thank you.
Let's start out with quickly with you in Indonesia. For example, very briefly,
I think
how have you managed to get it right?
I think briefly, you cannot really have a preset predictability because it's so unpredictable. And as economy grows, I guess everybody in the government also needs to quickly move. And I brought up one example of I was asked to be the first Uber consumer in Indonesia, so I took the taxi ride, and then I got a lot of angry letters from the government and also from taxi companies saying that you're basically violating the rules here. So I then complained to the company Uber, and Uber said that we're not a taxi company, so we don't need taxi license. So what are you violating? Well, on the tax code. So we go into the tax code. We're not an Indonesian company, so we're not liable to pay tax in Indonesia. So I guess this type of changes, institutional changes and adaptability needs to be built. And I think it's not only happening in Indonesia, it's happening also in other places in the world.
Yes.
There is a joke that was told by Albert Hirschman some time ago in an article beautiful about obstacles to the perception of change. He was speaking about himself, which I think is very important to do, to talk not about the other, but what the other tells to us. And the joke is as follows. Two people meet and one says to the other, Paul, what's happening? It has been 10 years, but you were small, now you are big. You were thin, now you are fat. And the other says, sorry, but my name is not Paul. You have changed so much, even the name. That's the attitude that we have. So we tend to not recognize the changes that are taking place in this country simply because they do not resemble to us. When we will learn that the Cold War is over, and now we may also see the differences that are happening in this country. About political changes, sorry, but what about South Africa getting out of apartheid? What about Chile students in the street? What about Thailand? What about the fact that in Africa, violent crime has reduced as opposed to manifestation that has increased? Please, students, you are young. There is a lot to be discovered in this country. I think this is the message that our Indonesian colleague is giving to us.
Mario's, I think the same point. I met a friend, a professor at Harvard, and he made an interesting comment. He said, we know what India will look like in the future because of the democracy. But China, we can't see how it will be stable in the future. So my comment to that was, the Chinese may disagree with you, because in the end, it's the Chinese who will find solutions for China. And you have to remember that China has been ongoing culture environment for 3,000 years. They have very profound, sophisticated views of the world and of themselves, of philosophy, of government. So they will find their own solutions. And I think that's the point, that these countries are not going to do what you think should be done. They will do what they think needs to be done for themselves.
Isn't that a destabilizing factor, though, if China's poised to become the world's #1 economy in terms of size, and everybody's still trying to second-guess exactly what's on China's government's mind?
Well, actually, the Chinese government is...
Or European government mind.
Exactly. The Chinese government is quite clear the Chinese government is clear what's on its mind. I mean, they set up their priorities, and I think there's a worry that they don't look like us. Deep down, that's the real worry. They don't not only look like us, they don't feel like us. I mean, they are now global consumers, they have a lot of money, but where's the democracy issue? Or where's... Now, what may be less known is China is a very merit-driven society. There's a huge, if you are not pulling your weight, you cut loose very quickly in the governmental system, in performance and things like that. Now, I think this debate of which system is better is not the right debate. I think each people have to find their own answers fundamentally. And I think we have to accept that the world is bigger than our own perspectives on the world. And therefore, diversity is a strength, not a weakness. And actually, it's a good thing that, and this sense of rivalry, this Francis Fukuyama's thing of cultures competing with each other, actually is a destructive position to take.
Just briefly, and I'll take another question.
Very, very briefly, I fully agree with that, and I think that's a good point to take. I would still bring back the fact that there is a strong element of uncertainty in it, that in the sort of democratic systems, whether they are Indian style or Western Europe style or US style, take all the different ramifications, there is a certain degree of predictability. A lot of unpredictable things happen in democracies, but it took Hitler a while to come to power, and the democratic parties in Germany had a lot to do with the problem, but it wasn't quite overnight, right? What happens in other systems is that a lot of sudden things can happen overnight, and that's where I think the uncertainty is for internal, and if it's a huge economy, has a huge effect on the world, could be for the external parties as well. That's, I think, all that's to be added here.
Monarchies also lasted for a very long time. So I think it's a question of what kind of democracy we're talking about. As I said, the aspiration of the Chinese people is also to be consulted, and that will happen. So they will find their own arrangements for that purpose. They will not be like Western democracies. That will not happen. And they have a 3,000-year history on that.
The most strongest element of uncertainty and discontinuity that happened recently were created in the United States and in Northern Europe. Or in Europe, let's say so. So uncertainty is not only the result of the process of decision-making, with electoral democracy. So in reality, I think that the turbulence we are observing is the result of many efforts, and we are strongly responsible, as well as some elements in development.
Let me take that other question from the student at Sciences Po, and if anybody else wants to raise their hand for a question, I'll take a few questions at once and put them to the panel.
Il y a quelques questions, effectivement, des étudiants de Sciences Po.
Good morning. My name is Christine Kai. I'm a graduate student in economics at Sciences Po. And my question is related to heterogeneity among these emerging markets that you mentioned. So you said that on the one hand, we have countries such as India that experienced short-run economic growth, and on the other hand, you have countries such as China that experience long-run economic growth. And so I was wondering why we have such contrast, how to explain it. You said, for instance, that these countries do not have the same models of economic growth. But so what factors, according to you, are crucial to have sustainable economic growth? You mentioned, for instance, political institutions, and you opposed democratic countries to non-democratic countries. And for instance, Professor Sveiner, if we listen to you, we have the impression that having a non-democratic government is necessary to have long-run economic growth. Do you all agree with that? Thank you.
Do you want to clarify your views?
Certainly didn't mean that. There are obviously a lot of ingredients, and if we had the answer, we wouldn't be here today. We actually don't have the answer to understand what causes, but we understand sort of where it is and how it happens a little bit more. East Asia is a good example. You know, there are other economies than China that have grown for decades and have done very well. Some of them have, strongly democratic systems, some less so. I think what's really special about China is that it's a large economy that has succeeded to grow for such a long time, so continuously. That's really what's new, not the fact that it's growing for several decades. We have other examples, Taiwan, Korea, so on, Singapore. So I think that's the question. And I'm not, arguing against the fact that there may be different guises. That's why I said, be it Indian democracy, be it Western, be it that. I'm just thinking in terms of checks and balances and ability of people, and this is where the international organizations are moving, to sort of all-inclusive, more conceptual view of what is well-being. And so part of it is, to what extent people can really shape what's going on. And as Khalid correctly says, I mean, the Chinese are including people more and more compared to where it was before. But it still is a system that, is somewhat highly centralized and therefore has that degree of uncertainty. If the center were to change its mind, and if you take longer piece of history in a number of countries, including China, it did change its mind. It can have major repercussions.
Professor Jens Wenja, can I just pick up on that point and spin things around to here where we are in Paris? In European countries, for instance, particularly the UK, where I come from, you're hearing an awful lot of frustration about the economic planning not being long-term enough because people are very, very keen to put forward policies that will get them enacted in the next 4 or 5 years or so. Do you think that we can learn something from slightly more centralized models of government? I know it's a contentious point, but to benefit people in the long run.
Definitely, and I think people are aware of that, and the democratic systems themselves have the mechanisms for it. So when they were one way or another endangered, times of war, they went to planning, right? I mean, all the Western democracies essentially had quantitative type planning when they needed it, and in times that were not as extremes, have been capable of having strategies for infrastructure development and so on that would have decade-long horizons. So it's just a question whether they select to do it or not, and you are making a very good point that politics has evolved in such a way that it does tend to have a much shorter horizon, and I think that's an important issue. What is it in the Western type, if we simplify democracies, but I think it's the same thing in India and elsewhere, that we tend to think on a shorter term, and businesses tend to do that as well. They go, again, the US model, but it's more general, kind of in the worldwide global competition. What matters is short-term results, short-term achievements, partially driven by expectations, going back back to your initial point, be it expectations of shareholders, be it expectations of people, right? And I think setting higher standards. Going to Europe, Europe has accomplished incredible development since World War II, but it's taken for granted. You know, the young Europeans can't imagine that they would live in France, where in what Jean-Paul can tell us, in the 1960s you could leave France with 500 francs and that was it. Otherwise you needed special permission. So if you told them that this is the alternative, they would, you know, think you're totally crazy. They're taking all the accomplishments they have, including the Erasmus programs and everything, totally for granted, right? So the expectations are driving in part.
And many people would say that that change in expectations, short-term planning by governments has created the protest votes that we've seen around Europe. I'll just quickly ask you, Reuben, about India. India's got a new change at the helm with Narendra Modi. That's ushering in a new era of economic hope and potential prosperity. Just going back to that question there, India and China, who has the right model, if you like? Which one is the right model? How do they differ?
I think it's impossible to say which the right model is. I mean, I think if you look at long run versus short-term economic growth, I suspect that if you look carefully, what you'll actually find is the ones that have had long-run growth are actually the countries that have basically initiated tough structural reform, both product and factor market reforms. And I think a lot of countries that boomed in the 2000s, one could make an argument that that was probably because of a commodity super cycle and cheap credit floating around the world. Now, it's very hard to tell what was driving it. So, in effect, I don't think it's as much a question of democracy versus not democracy, but it's a question of who has the ability to do those structural reforms. And I suspect that that may actually come down to a question of leadership rather than anything else. And then that's where a lot of the hope in India is sitting on, which is the fact that, yes, we're a democracy, we're a messy democracy, but in Modi, we may actually have a leader that has the backbone to push through those tough structural reforms.
And give you the example of Bangladesh. By the way, in South Asia, despite India's rapid progress, the country which has done the best in terms of meeting the Millennium Goals is actually Bangladesh. It doesn't have a very inspiring governmental system or a political culture. But the reason why, by the way, decade after decade is kept on growing, 6%, for now 3 decades almost. And the reason is very simple. It invested in women's education. Profound shift which took place in the 80s and 90s. It also allowed microfinance to become like a macro variable, meaning it went and affected millions of people's lives, not just a few 100,000. And these things together, despite a dysfunctional governmental system, has allowed it to continue. You remember Bangladesh in the 80s was seen, Kissinger made this famous statement that this will be the worst case scenario for any developing country. Now, export earnings are 20 times the size of aid inflows. So you have a very vibrant system. Population growth rates collapsed in Bangladesh, 1.3, 1.4%. Muslim country, one of the lowest growth rates in population in the world now. So East Pakistan, West Pakistan, East Pakistan became Bangladesh, had higher population than West Pakistan, which is now Pakistan. And fast forward 20, 30 years, Bangladesh is 155, 156 million people. We are 200 million. So there's a lot which can happen, and actually the issue of investing in people is key because you empower people. You empower them to take their own decisions, and that makes a big difference. By the way, Bangladesh has done the best in South Asia in meeting the Millennium Goals, far better than India, just to give you a perspective.
Let me just see whether there is 1 or 2 more burning questions in the audience, because we're 3 minutes.
Il y a quelques questions parce que nous n'avons plus beaucoup de temps.
Khalid Malik, the student's question referred specifically also to China, and this is your great forte. Do people ever say, well, when you try and explain China and China's economic planning and thinking and its resilience, that perhaps you're defending China too much? China seems to be up against a lot of skepticism.
You know, when I was in China, I was heading the UN system there, and I brought together a lot of the major media representatives to have lunch with me. And I asked them that I can't find any single positive story on China in the newspapers, in global newspapers. There must be something China has done well, which can be highlighted. And there is, by the way, don't listen to me, just look at the last few decades of reporting on China. So, of course, it affects people's perspective on China. It's generally a negative thing. But when you talk to the Chinese are full of hope. They believe in the future. They are doing better in everything. They have much more flexibility in they are expressing their views. That the only thing which is still is a kind of a difficult thing is the political transition issues. What will happen? But the rest of the space is quite large. And if you look at the social media in China, it's a very active social media. People have views on everything. So it's a very vibrant society and culture in that sense.
Right. Now, speaking of which, I'm afraid we're over time, gentlemen. Thank you very much. I'm going to thank our esteemed panelists. I think we've really covered an awful lot of ground here. But considering, as you mentioned, social media, I would encourage you all to continue the discussion online. You know the hashtag here of the forum. Please continue to continue it with me and the rest of them online. Thank you very much.